Destiny does not always arrive the way we expect, but it always arrives at the right time. Thomas Mitchell adjusted his hat for the 10th time that morning, his trembling fingers betraying the anxiety he tried to hide behind his stiff posture. He had built his small farm with his own hands, each plank nailed with the hope of a future that had never arrived alone. 3 years of correspondence with Eleanor Patterson of Boston had filled the empty days with dreams of a family, of laughter echoing through the silent house he had built in the greenest valley in all of Beaumont County. The midday sun battered the parched earth of the small railway station, turning the air into waves of heat that danced on the gleaming tracks. Thomas had arrived 2 hours early, unable to remain home as his future loomed on iron wheels. In the inner pocket of his coat, he carried the 16 letters Eleanor had sent him, each one carefully folded and reread hundreds of times until the words were etched in his memory as prayers. The station was little more than a shed of sun-faded wood, with a lonely bench where the merchant Jenkins now sat, chewing tobacco and watching the tracks with the patience of someone who had seen many arrivals and departures. The dry wind carried the aroma of sage and dust, mixed with the acrid odor of sweat and leather that emanated from the few horses tied to the nearby pole. 3 children played in the scant shade of a gnarled oak tree, their voices drowned out by the oppressive heat that made even the dogs seek refuge. Thomas took out his father's pocket watch again and found that it was only 15 minutes away. His heart beat out of step like the hooves of a racing horse. He had shaved himself in the morning so carefully that small cuts still marked his chin, reminders of hands too nervous to hold the razor firmly. The navy blue suit, the only one he owned, was impeccable, stored for months for this special occasion. Eleanor's letters painted a portrait of a refined and delicate woman, educated in Boston's best colleges, the daughter of a prosperous merchant who had lost his fortune in railroad speculation. She wrote about her passion for literature, her culinary skills, and her dream of finding a hard-working, honest man with whom she could build a simple life, away from the complications of the big city. Thomas had answered each letter with the gruff sincerity of a man who had spent more time talking to cattle than to human beings. The distant whistle of the locomotive cut through the air like a battle cry, making Thomas jump from the seat where he had finally sat. His hat almost flew away with the sudden movement, and he held it tightly as if it were a talisman against bad luck. The horses' hooves beat nervously against the earth, and even the dogs raised their heads, alert to the sound that announced the arrival of news in the small village. The locomotive surged like an iron beast, spewing steam and black smoke, its pistons hammering away at a hypnotic rhythm that made the earth shake underfoot. Thomas felt the sweat run down his back, mixing nervousness with the merciless heat of summer in Texas. I had imagined this moment thousands of times, rehearsed the first words I would say, thought about the first kiss they would have after the wedding that was already scheduled for the following week in the small Methodist church in the city. The train slowed down with a metallic noise of protesting brakes, sparks flying off the tracks like shooting stars in broad daylight. A cloud of steam enveloped the makeshift platform, creating a white veil that turned figures into spectral shadows. Thomas shook his sweaty hands, bracing himself for the moment that would change his life forever, not suspecting that fate had prepared a surprise that no correspondence could have revealed. The steam slowly dissipated, like curtains being drawn on the real-life stage. Thomas took 3 steps forward, his heart hammering against his ribs hard enough that he believed everyone at the station could hear. The door of the passenger car slammed open with a metallic creak, and the driver, a thin man with grey mustaches, got out first to help the passengers. An elderly lady emerged first, followed by a pot-bellied merchant carrying a battered leather briefcase. Thomas scanned each face, looking for the delicate features Eleanor had described in her letters. Her eyes passed on a man in a striped suit, 2 children who ran towards a woman who was waiting for them, and then she appeared in the doorway as a human mountain dressed in dark blue. Eleanor Patterson was at least 6 feet tall and had shoulders wider than those of any man Thomas had ever met. His arms, thick as young oak trunks, held a leather suitcase as easily as Thomas carried a sack of oatmeal. The travel dress, though well cut and of fine fabric, stretched over a body that looked as if it had been sculpted for heavy work, not for the refined salons of Boston. Thomas felt his legs wobble. For a terrible moment, he thought he was going to faint right there under the scorching sun, in front of everyone present. Eleanor walked down the steps of the train with firm steps that made the wooden platform groan under her weight. When her feet touched the ground, she rose in all her grandeur, shadowing not only Thomas, but practically all the men present in the small station. She looked around with clear, intelligent eyes, a shy smile playing on her full lips. There was an unexpected delicacy in his movements, as if he was aware of his size and tried to minimize it through posture. When his eyes met Thomas's, the smile widened, revealing white, well-groomed teeth. She waved discreetly, and Thomas noticed that her hands, though large, had long, elegant fingers. The farmer remained paralyzed for long seconds, his mind trying to reconcile the image of the delicate woman he had created through the letters with the imposing reality that was approaching him. Eleanor walked with surprising grace for someone of her stature, carefully avoiding the children who ran across the platform and politely greeting the people who crossed her path. Thomas was finally able to move his legs, even though he felt as if he was walking through quicksand. Each step toward Eleanor seemed to take forever. He noticed that she had stopped a few meters away, waiting for him to approach, her eyes showing a mixture of hope and apprehension that mirrored exactly what he himself felt. When they finally came face to face, Thomas had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes. Eleanor was at least 8 inches taller than him, and her physical presence completely dominated the space around him. Silence stretched between them like a taut rope, while others at the station began to notice the unusual situation and whispered discreetly. Eleanor was the first to break the visual silence. She held out one of her large hands in greeting, a gesture at once formal and gentle. Thomas looked at that hand that could easily wrap around his too, noting the calloused palms that revealed a life of work, something his letters had never mentioned. There were small scars on her fingers, marks that told stories of an existence very different from the one she had described. The hot wind swept across the platform, kicking up a cloud of dust that caused both of them to blink. At that moment, Thomas saw something in Eleanor's eyes that touched him deeply. There was vulnerability there, an emotional fragility that contrasted sharply with his obvious physical strength. She was as nervous as he was, maybe more so, and this realization began to dissolve the initial shock that had overwhelmed him. Thomas reached out and touched hers. Eleanor's fingers were surprisingly soft, despite the calluses, and her handshake was carefully controlled, as if she was always aware of her own strength. In that touch, he felt an almost imperceptible tremor, and he realized that, regardless of her impressive size, Eleanor Patterson was simply a woman who had traveled far and wide in search of the very thing he was looking for, someone to share life with. Thomas's wagon seemed even smaller, with Eleanor sitting next to him in the driver's seat. The poor draft animal, a chestnut horse named Bruno, who had always done the job with ease, now breathed heavier as he pulled the extra load down the dusty roads leading to the farm. Eleanor kept her hands carefully clasped in her lap, trying to take up as little space as possible, though her shoulders still touched Thomas's with every jolt of the cart. Conversation had been scarce during the first few minutes of the trip. Thomas had tried to make some observations about the weather and the landscape, but his voice came out strangled, as if someone was squeezing his throat. Eleanor answered with polite monosyllables, staring blankly at the road ahead. The discomfort between them was palpable, as thick as the dust rising from the wheels of the wagon. It was Eleanor who finally broke through the barrier of awkward silence. His voice was surprisingly melodious for someone of his stature, loaded with a refined Boston accent that contrasted with his rugged appearance. She commented on the beauty of the Texan landscape, on how the rolling hills differed from the dense forests of Massachusetts. Thomas noted that she carefully avoided any mention of the letters they had exchanged or the expectations they both had about this meeting. As they approached the property, Thomas felt a mixture of pride and apprehension growing in his chest. He had spent the last 3 years improving every corner of the farm, always imagining the moment when he would show everything to Eleanor. The new fence, painted white the previous month, the apple orchard he had planted thinking about the children they would have, the porch he had built specifically so they could sit together on summer afternoons, watching the sun set over the pastures. As the house appeared on the horizon, small and cozy against the backdrop of the green hills, Eleanor emitted an almost inaudible sigh. Thomas could not interpret whether it was relief, disappointment, or simple fatigue from the trip. The house, which had always seemed to him suitable for a family, now proved almost fragile in the face of the imposing presence of his future wife. Eleanor stepped out of the wagon with careful movements, first testing the strength of the stirrup before entrusting all her weight to it. Thomas watched as she looked around the property, her eyes scanning the barn, the corral where 2 dairy cows grazed peacefully, and the small garden he proudly maintained. There was something about his expression that he couldn't decipher, a mixture of practical evaluation and something that could be hope. Inside the house, the contrast became even more evident. Eleanor had to bend over to get through the front door, and her head almost touched the ceiling beams in the main room. Thomas watched as she moved with extreme care, as if she were in a dollhouse, testing each chair before sitting down and avoiding sudden gestures that might knock over an object. The afternoon passed in a series of disconnected and awkward moments. Thomas showed her the room he had prepared, his own room, since he had assumed they would sleep together after the wedding. Eleanor examined the bed with practical eyes, and he watched her mentally measure whether the furniture would support her weight. He had built everything with durability in mind, but he had never imagined that he would be put to the test in this way. During dinner, which Eleanor insisted on preparing despite Thomas's polite protests, he found that she was indeed an excellent cook, just as she had stated in her letters. But watching her work in the small kitchen was like watching a giant trying to operate instruments made for smaller hands. She held the pots with a touching delicacy, as if they were made of crystal. As they ate in silence, Thomas secretly studied Eleanor's face. There was a solid beauty there, well-defined features and expressive eyes that revealed intelligence and gentleness. When she smiled, which happened with increasing frequency as the night wore on, he glimpsed the refined woman he had known through the letters, only in a very different package than he had expected. It was when Eleanor got up to fetch more water that the incident happened. Her skirt hooked on the leg of the table, and the sudden movement to untangle made her bump into the shelf where Thomas kept his mother's dishes. The sound of crockery shattering on the wooden floor echoed through the house like a gunshot. Eleanor stood paralyzed in the middle of the shards, her huge hands covering her face in a gesture of horror and shame. Thomas saw his tears flow through his fingers, and at that moment he understood something fundamental about the woman who had come so far to marry him. Behind all that physical strength was a delicate soul, bruised by years of unintentional accidents and embarrassment in a world built for lesser people. Thomas moved unhurriedly, his bare feet treading carefully between the shards of crockery strewn across the kitchen floor. Eleanor stood motionless in the center of the destruction, her sobs muffled by the hands that covered her face. He had seen men cry before, during the war, when they lost comrades, when they received terrible news from home. But I had never witnessed such pure pain as that emanating from the gigantic woman who tried to make herself invisible in her own shame. He knelt down and began to collect the larger pieces of porcelain, each shard a memory of his mother that now lay shattered. They were the last tangible vestiges of her, the dishes on which she had served her last meals before the fever took her through the harsh winter of 1868. Thomas held a fragment that still showed some of the delicate blue floral print, and for a moment he felt the familiar twinge of longing pierce his chest. Eleanor lowered her hands, revealing red, swollen eyes that looked even bigger on her anguished face. His voice came out hoarse, loaded with years of similar accidents and accumulated embarrassments. She tried to explain herself, the words running over in her haste to justify the unjustifiable. She talked about how she had always been clumsy, about how things seemed to break in her hands without her wanting to, about how she had learned to avoid social situations precisely to prevent moments like that. Thomas kept picking up the pieces as he listened, his serene expression contrasting with the growing despair in Eleanor's voice. When she finished speaking, he stood up slowly, holding in the palm of his hand the fragments he had managed to gather. He looked at them for a long moment, as if he could retrace the past through willpower, and then did something that surprised them both. He walked to the kitchen window and, without hesitation, threw the shards out in the direction of the small garden where his mother used to plant herbs. The sound of the fragments touching the earth was soft, almost musical. Eleanor looked at him with an expression of utter incredulity, as if he had just performed a miracle or committed an unforgivable blasphemy. Thomas returned to the center of the kitchen, where Eleanor still remained paralyzed. He held out his hands, palms up, in a gesture that asked for hers. Eleanor hesitated for a moment that seemed eternal, then slowly placed her huge hands on his. Thomas's palms disappeared completely under Eleanor's fingers, but there was a tenderness to the touch that transcended any difference in size. That night, sitting on the porch under a star-studded sky, they finally had a real conversation. Eleanor told of her childhood in Boston, the daughter of a man who had made his fortune in the spice trade before losing it all to risky investments. She described how she had grown faster and taller than any girl her age, how dresses never fit, how boys looked at her with fear or mockery. She had lied in the letters, admitted with painful honesty, not out of malice, but out of desperation. She had been 32 years old and had never known love. Each suitor who appeared fled when he met her in person. Some were too polite to openly show their rejection. Others simply disappeared without explanation. Thomas was her last hope of finding someone who could see her beyond her intimidating size. Thomas listened in silence, occasionally shaking his head or making small sounds of understanding. When she finished, he shared his own story. He talked about the years of loneliness after the death of his parents, about how he had built the farm stone by stone in the hope of attracting a family. He admitted that he had also omitted certain truths in his letters, how small the ranch was, how he sometimes struggled to make ends meet, how there were nights when he talked to the cattle, only to hear a voice, even if it was his own. The full moon lit up their faces as the conversation deepened. Eleanor talked about her fears of hurting someone unintentionally, of never finding clothes that fit properly, of always feeling like an outsider in any environment. Thomas shared his own fears, of dying alone, of the farm being sold to strangers after his death, of never hearing the laughter of children echoing through the house he had built with so much love. When they finally retired to sleep, there was something different in the air between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of mutual understanding. Thomas prepared a makeshift bed in the living room, insisting that Eleanor take the room. She protested, worried that the bed would not support her weight, but he reassured her, explaining that he had built everything with durability in mind. For the first time since she had stepped off the train, Eleanor smiled with genuine tranquility. It was a smile that completely transformed her face, revealing the sweet and intelligent woman who hid behind the self-defense armor she had built over the years. Thomas fell asleep that night with the image of that smile etched into his memory, and for the first time in months, he didn't dream of loneliness. The morning arrived with the crowing of roosters and the aroma of strong coffee coming from the kitchen. Thomas awoke on the sofa in the living room, his body aching from the furniture too small for his average height, but with a feeling of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Eleanor had woken up before him and was already preparing breakfast, moving around the kitchen with the same caution as the night before, but with less tension on her broad shoulders. The days that followed turned into a delicate dance of mutual discovery. Eleanor proved to be not only an excellent cook, but also a tireless worker. His hands, which seemed so clumsy with delicate objects, proved surprisingly skilled with tools and heavy labor. She repaired the corral fence that Thomas had been putting off for months, carried bales of hay that normally required 2 men, and milked the cows with a gentleness that the animals seemed to appreciate. Thomas watched her work with growing admiration. Eleanor possessed a natural strength that she had learned to hide, but here in the vastness of the farm, she could finally use her gifts without embarrassment. When she lifted a wooden beam that he could barely drag, there was a grace in her movements that transcended any question of size or appearance. The real revelation came in the 3rd week, when a violent storm hit the region. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and the rain punished the roof hard enough to make the whole house tremble. Thomas had gone out to check on the animals when a heavy branch of the century-old oak tree near the barn collapsed, trapping him underneath and fracturing his left leg. He screamed for help, but the sound was lost in the roar of the storm. The pain was intense, and the weight of the branch impossible to move on its own. It was Eleanor who found him, running barefoot through the mud, her loose hair whipping her face in the pouring rain. Without hesitation, she positioned herself beside the branch and lifted it as if it were made of straw, freeing Thomas in a matter of seconds. She carried him back home in her arms, like a mother carries a child, protecting him from the rain with her own body. Thomas, semi-unconscious from grief, had the strange sensation of being completely safe for the first time in his adult life. There was something deeply comforting about being cared for by someone whose physical strength could stand up to any adversity. During the weeks of recovery, Eleanor completely took over the farm. She dealt with the merchants who came to buy cattle, negotiated prices with a cunning that surprised Thomas, and kept the property running better than he had been able to do on his own. The neighbors, initially curious and some openly mocking about the gigantic woman, soon came to respect her when they saw her competence and dedication. The transformation in Eleanor was visible day after day. The shy, apologetic woman who had gotten off the train had given way to someone confident and self-assured. She still moved carefully inside the house, but outside she walked with firm steps and head held high. Thomas realized that she had finally found a place where she could be fully herself. The wedding took place on an autumn morning, 6 months after Eleanor's arrival. The ceremony was simple in the small Methodist church, with only a few neighbors present. Reverend Morrison, a short, chubby man, had to tilt his head back to look into the bride's eyes, but his blessing was sincere and warm. Thomas wore the same navy blue suit as the day he had met her, this time without nervous beard cuts. Eleanor had sewn her own dress, a simple but elegant model that enhanced her imposing figure instead of trying to hide it. When they exchanged rings, his hands completely disappeared into hers, but the gesture had an intimacy that made several women present sigh with emotion. The farm prospered in the years that followed. Eleanor proved to be a born manager, expanding operations to include a small dairy and even a few beehives. Thomas, still limping slightly from his fractured leg, concentrated on the tasks he enjoyed most, caring for the animals and keeping the fields in order. They functioned as a perfect team, each complementing the other's skills. The children arrived one at a time. First Samuel, a stout boy who inherited his mother's height and his father's patience, then Mary, who at the age of 5 already showed signs that she would be as strong as Eleanor. Finally, the twins, Daniel and David, who ran around the farm like small hurricanes. Thomas sometimes stopped in the middle of work to observe his family. Eleanor sitting on the porch he had built, dreaming of this moment, sewing while watching the children play in the yard. She no longer tried to make herself small or invisible. She had found her place in the world, and the world had adjusted around her. On winter evenings, when the family gathered around the fireplace, Thomas thought about the letters they had exchanged years before. Both had lied about certain things, omitted important details, created idealized versions of themselves. But underneath the well-intentioned lies, there was a fundamental truth that no correspondence could have communicated. They needed each other exactly as they were. Eleanor never broke dishes in the kitchen again, not because she had become less clumsy, but because Thomas had replaced all the delicate porcelain dishes with sturdy metal utensils. It was a small adaptation, like so many others they have made over the years, each one an act of love disguised as practicality. Fate, they discovered, rarely arrives in the package we expect, but when it arrives in the right form, for our real needs, rather than our imagined dreams, it can be more perfect than any fantasy we dared to cherish. If this story of unlikely love and acceptance has touched your heart, you can't miss our upcoming adventures of the American Wild West, where each narrative reveals how fate finds unexpected ways to unite lonely souls under the relentless sun of the frontier. Subscribe to the channel and leave your comment below, telling us what was the most emotional moment of this story for you. Was it when Eleanor broke the dishes and revealed her fragility? When Thomas threw the shards out of the window in a gesture of pure understanding? Or when she saved him during the storm, showing that true strength comes from the heart?